You're not going to scare us today, are you?
No, no, this is not a scary one
Okay.
yet.
All right, I have about 10 a.m. Pacific time. Good morning and or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, Deep Dive on Defender for Cloud. My name's Mike Klass, and I'm an account manager here at KAMIND IT. Before we get rolling today, a couple housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you could keep your microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be excellent. With many of us working from home, we'd like to eliminate all background distraction noises. If you have any questions mid-presentation, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your questions into the presentation best we can. We will be recording today's webinar, so if you're uncomfortable with this, now would be your opportunity to opt out. Now with that out of the way, let's get down to business. With some of Microsoft's product rebranding lately, some people think that Defender for Cloud is a new name for CAS, Cloud App Security, and that's definitely not the case. Defender for Cloud is actually a family of products that help protect your resources, and those resources can live either up in the cloud or on-prem. So hopefully by the end of the webinar today, you'll have a good understanding of how better to protect your resources no matter where they live. So please sit back, relax, and let's hear our President and CEO, Mr. Matt Katzer, talk to us today about Deep Dive on Defender for Cloud. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, Mike, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Yeah, Defender for Cloud's a very interesting product if you look at the history that Microsoft had. And it's all about the Azure Security Center, for those who remember that back. That was kind of the core piece of it. And then what Microsoft did is, as they kind of rebranded various products in the Defender product line, they kind of moved it together. So anyway, so we're going to walk through all the pieces of it, and we'll see how this can work in your environment. It really is a lot of interesting feature. So if you're basically having on-premise resources in Google Cloud, AWS, and Azure, Defender for Cloud, you want to enable the services to basically manage and monitor the whole environment. It's the only way really to handle a lot of the information that you're going to be coming across. Okay, quick little bit about those for basically about KAMIND. We're a Microsoft managed partner. We're one of the 200 some odd direct managed licensed resellers with Microsoft. We're also one of the 42 partners that provide the GCC High for the Department of Defense subscriptions for the defense contractors. We're also kind of one of the other things we have. We're the firm. We're also a certified CMC CCP, a certified CMC practitioner. So there's a lot of different things we have. We're all about security and compliance, and we've been doing 365 since the day one. And I've published over 7 books, and one of the books we sold on the 365, we sold over 280,000 copies of 365. So it really is a very interesting time to see how this changed over time. Previously, we gave a webinar. We were talking about security, and security is, when we talk about the security stack, there's a whole ton of products. And part of the questions that we had from our clients is that, hey, this is great on the security stack. Let's go see the individual components. So what we have here, Defender for Cloud, is actually one of those components that you have. So from this aspect, we look at it, security has never been more critical in terms of the environment that you actually have. And let's see, hopefully my page, it looks my screen just swapped. Let me just reshare this and put it back, make sure we got the screen back for everyone. So just give me a second to take care of this and put it in place. There we go. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that from that standpoint. So you see the pieces that we have in terms of what's going on in the environment. And really you look at what's the pieces that's happening. It's really about today's defenders in terms of what's going on. There's so many password attacks coming through in terms of the amount of, there's not enough workers in place. The time it takes for remediation after a breach is just really amazing in terms of what's happening. In fact, we came through a recent event where basically they actually will go through and collect information and stealthily trying to figure out how the best way to actually plan and propagate the attack. But you look from the environment, it's just the complexity of environment. It's just mind-boggling because in terms of you got cloud services now, you have in terms of other services, in terms of IoT devices, in terms of partner resources, what's on-prem, what's in the cloud, what's in Azure, what's in AWS. You have a ton of different areas that you actually have to look at and worry about security and how it fits in. And from a different standpoint, looking at what Microsoft has done, in terms of looking in terms of this, the frontline capabilities in terms of what they're actually protecting and what they're actually analyzing on threats on a daily basis. When you start thinking about the amount of threats that they actually deal with, these are alerts and signals, 65 trillion daily. That's the amount in terms of what is actually happening in terms of the environment. And so what Microsoft has done is built a very robust security strategy that's best of class across all the categories. And as you look in terms of when you look at this, and it's really super important now because in the old days, you used to plug in different types of security models in. Well, I like this vendors for this product. I like this vendors for product A, or I like protection. Those strategies have really changed because now in terms of doing end-to-end protection of the environment, you have to structure it in such a way that basically addresses everything that you have. So it's really is an integrated solution. Spam filters, for instance, the simple thing that people use. Spam filters are so integrated now in the security stack. Spam filters actually touch in terms of the endpoint, in terms of the vulnerabilities on it. It touches the AI engine, how to analyze it. It looks in the environment, how people look in terms of junk mail and what is a quarantine and other mail that comes in your environment and what types of attacks you're going through. And a lot of attacks that happen, they're basically passive and they have to basically be addressed in your environment. So the spam filters are critical. So when you pull one piece out, you're breaking something else. There's no concept of basically plug and play in different modules in the modern security stack is really non-existent. It just no longer works anymore. In fact, if I look in terms of the environments that we actually been into, where we bought into help and remediation, where we've seen incidents, it's because they basically have a third-party product and the products are not integrated. So they don't all talk to each other. And the changes are really speedy in terms of what has to be done. You have to basically integrate everything. And then when you talk about Defender for Cloud, it's really looking at this whole module in terms of what Microsoft has done and trying to figure out how to put these various solution parts together, because it's all about detection, it's all about mitigation, and it's protecting the sensitive data. And the Microsoft security hardening model in terms of the single stack is really on a couple of different areas in terms of Purview, Priva, what Microsoft Intune does, and also in what Entra. When we talk about Defender for Cloud, in this case, we're actually talking about various pieces of all these different type of technologies that roll in there in terms of the Defender product line. And one of the questions you can actually look at the number of Defender product lines, and it's like, okay, couldn't you pick a better name or what type of strategy? But for clarity, what we're going to talk about today, these are the Defender products that we're actually looking at. You got Defender for Cloud, and in Defender for Cloud, you got Defender for Servers, you got storage, you got SQL, containers for those that are doing Kubernetes, you got app services, key vaults, DNS, resource manager, and also open source relational databases as well. And the interesting thing about the Defender for Cloud approach, it's a multi-vendor approach where basically you can actually deploy this in on-prem environments. You can deploy it in terms of GCP environments or AWS environments. So it's really fascinating how this has changed. So in this case, we're talking about really those functionality and features that you actually get from, this is the old Azure Security Center. So we're talking about basically doing the security posture that you see. and in terms of going through and looking at the the regulations that you have in place. What type of assets do you actually have, and what type of, in terms of remediation events that actually happened. And all these things you look at from a characteristics and trying to figure out what is the best way to actually, integrate the functionality in your tenant. I mean, the reality is, and you have to basically put the functionality in almost every environment that you have, because you can no longer really trust in terms of what's happening in the various pieces. So looking at pieces like that you actually see, the first thing that comes in mind is you got to have a governance model. You have to look in terms of what the regulatory compliance is. Now, Defender for Cloud is kind of the basis for that in terms of the Microsoft governance strategy. So it's really, that's kind of feeds all the various regulation policy and the procedures that you have put in place. And that's kind of the key aspect of it. The other feature that you have when you start integrating all these features together and you're collecting all this data, collecting data from an on-site environment, like in our guard environments, we collect them in log analytics, and also we collect it from resources. And one of the features I think is the coolest is really this one, is attack path analysis. So you can actually look in terms of events. Where is the data flow in the environment? What systems are it's actually touching, to actually see where the attack path is going to be. And this is really critical, because as you look in terms of the complexity of the environment and you're doing different types of things, you really need to understand what's happened. And this is why we go through, this is kind of key in terms of Defender for Cloud. It's one of the nice features to have. And for those that are more want to go dive into and see the everyday pieces and basically be able to build it out, you also have a Cloud Security Explorer, which you can actually drive down into the resources and figure out what they actually have and what you can do on the pieces. So it's really that's kind of the core form of three types processes that you actually have. And let's go look at some of the other parts associated with this. So the first thing that comes in mind is that, okay, we have a Cloud Explorer, we have attack path analysis. How do we actually feed data into that environment so we can actually make decisions? Well, the first thing is basically you have Defender for servers. And Defender for Server, when you actually look at it, you can deploy it in terms of on-prem environments. You can deploy it on Google Cloud, AWS. You're collecting information. You're collecting the information in Azure Arc and feed it into Azure, so you can basically make an attack path analysis on it. And this is the type of things you look in terms of integrated strategies. You're really trying to figure out is, how do I get the data, and how do I collect the data so I can make informed decisions? Because type of decisions you're going to make are going to be, because you have limited staff and what capabilities. Some of those decisions are going to be automatic remediations. Some decisions are going to be a little bit more investigation in terms of what's going on. So that's kind of the piece on it. Now, as we've seen with what's happened in terms of in terms of the Microsoft environment, and also in terms of our own, and this is happening to yours, is you start getting more of a development and operations mentality, because you're actually trying to figure out how do you actually scale certain things, because there's a lot of tools coming out from Microsoft that is basically low code or no code. So you have to empower the security teams with a strategy to basically make sure they're building the right applications, the scripts that are being put together, all the various pieces that you expect and actually have to make sure you can actually put it together and use it across different environments. Now, the other aspect you have in terms of the whole DevOps model is really you're trying to figure out, okay, how do you actually build in alerts and build in information so you can actually make sure that your security team or your developers are actually doing the necessary checks and balances. That's another key portion. And then it's along with this is you got to basically make sure that whatever gets put together, you have integrated security intelligence to basically manage what's going on in the pieces of it. So that's kind of like the core that we look at a development operation standpoint, but there's other pieces too. And typically you have, in terms of what's happening now, especially with AI, you have logic apps, or the so-called low code, no code application, drag and drop a set of logic environments. And that's what logic apps is. So logic apps is a feature that's enabled on Defender for Cloud to help generate recommendations. So you can actually go through and look in the environment and generate from alerts and figure out what the things you should be fixed. Now this is a lot of things you run into is that when you look at information like this, it's about data collection. Now, in our case, we also have a tool called Guard Plus, which we actually take and data mine the entire 365 organization tenant, and then we prioritize and look at information. Similar, but it's similar to what is here in the cloud recommendation, a little bit different because it's putting things in priority of what the needs are based on what the customer would like to see. In terms of other pieces that you actually have, it's also trying to get the recommendations to put in place in terms of what needs to fix in terms of the code. And then the other aspect you have in terms of dealing with the DevOps team is make sure that whatever remediated, whatever it does, is basically you follow a governance process. There's a governance rule that you need to follow. So if your organization want to manage data a certain way, that you're doing what you should be doing and set target rates and basically security level. Now you go expand the pieces on what happens in Defender for Cloud. Where would it be without SQL? And SQL is a core part of it in all business environments. And when you look in terms of what's happening with like Defender for SQL, which is part of the Defender for Cloud's product suites, it's basically trying to put the necessary things for detection, assessment, and also basically trying to protect the SQL servers. And there's really an interesting process, and I have a different chart later on that I can actually show you than how you look from a big, you start at the outside, big area you look at, how you shrink it, small area, how you shrink another area to get better analysis of what's going on in the environment. But it's key thing to keep in mind is that Defender for Cloud is designed to be multi-cloud support. So you could have a SQL database that's an on-prem, you could have a SQL database that's in a GCP or AWS, and you can integrate all those features into the alert model and everything else to basically kind of protect the environment, which is what you want to do. And looking what I mentioned earlier, they had this chart in terms of how things are actually handled. So we can actually look in terms of looking at data from a standpoint of basically we want to really secure the data, but in order to secure the data, there's steps on it. Like here, you got to basically kind of get the firewall in place, get permission structures in place, and then you actually go through and look at what's the vulnerability and how do you put the necessary encryption in place, and then you address the final issue. So you can stair step an implementation down until you actually need so you actually really need it. And that's kind of key in terms of the SQL environment because it's already about starting at the outside and working in. And you look in terms of other features you're trying to do, you want to take protection action. It's really about enabling the services, protecting that hybrid client workload, and basically monitoring the alerts. And that's kind of the whole strategy of SQL. And when you actually deploy SQL, that's what you're doing. You're trying to make sure that the data integrity is maintained. And it gets into one thing when you think of SQL, for instance, the other question that pops up that people always ask, what about containers? What about Karate's containers? Well, the same type of philosophy happens with that, in terms of containers, in terms of software containers and images and the runtime. You have the ability to actually manage all that. And you also have the ability to basically look at Kubernetes, for instance, and do runtime protection. So it's actually designed in such a way, Defender for Cloud, you can enable the service and really have a service that's set up to really go against in terms of these patterns that are pretty standard patterns of attack and how do you actually defend the environment. And that's the key thing when you look at all these pieces. The Microsoft Defender for Clouds really structured is that there's tons of services you put on, you manage and monitor the service to basically get the maximum desired results. And that's kind of super critical. And if you look in terms of just some of the other features that we actually had earlier in terms of threat detection, you have the same type of functionality. On one of the earlier slides we talked about basically attack surface and how to basically understand what the attack structure would be. And advanced threat detection is another module that does that type of functionality. Now, this is all fun and good. This is about certain areas. You may not use some of the containers or some of the Kubernetes structure, but that's okay, because what we probably all do is use backup, and we use onto some type of Azure storage model. Well, it's the same thing that you actually have to deal with. You're looking in terms of, you have an approved system, you're looking in terms of recent patterns that are basically breaking the norm. That's why the spam filters are rolled in, so you can actually have that logic. Then you start expanding on the significant suspicious activities. And then also you go through the spam filter and you upload the you upload the manual content to basically figure out, okay, how to actually manage this stuff, how to actually manage the config, how to actually manage problems. And so you got to scan and deal with all this stuff on the real time. Now, looking at this is that you have, when you look at cloud-based storage, and I got a really cool slide that talks about the remediation step. But if you look in terms of a bad actor, what they're doing, this gives you pretty much the process diagram they actually have to actually see how all this fits together. Now, when you look at the combination of things, you actually, in terms of looking at blob storage, the key thing is basically being able to detect and remediate the problems associated with it. And that's actually pretty straightforward, because what you have to do initially is basically just enable it. And once you enable some of the security controls, and all the Defender for Cloud apps are structured this way, then you start enabling additional features that you can go through, and to the point that you basically start remediate the problem. And then and that's really what the goal. Now in this slide, you've noticed that right here we have Sentinel. This is really important too, because in our SecOps team, for instance, is even though we may automatically remediate events, the events actually have to be expanded and looked at to verify if this is going to be, if we're doing the right things. And as we look through the Defender and remediation, that's one of the key pieces. So it's really trying to basically be able to to really kind of detect what's going on, and make sure we have the right areas that cover all the threats, and basically trying to figure out how to actually reduce risk in terms of what we actually need. And it's really the other aspect of it with the Defender for Cloud. All those pieces are pulled together. They're all centralized together, so you give that single same page point of glass. And some of the features that you actually look at in terms of looking at it, it's, they're trying to look at, what's the access? What's the, like, we have a lot of conditional access controls that we put in place, but it's all trying to figure out how to actually get the controls and the access around to make sure you don't have an issue. And what type of activity that you actually have, what type of their data exploration going on that's kind of abnormal for that behavior. And I think everyone now is at the point to understand that Microsoft actually implements an AI model in the high-end security products like the 365 E5 series to really look at what's going on. So when you have the features enabled, you basically can get early warning on, do you have problems or do you not have problems? So that's really super special. And the one that I kind of like the most, this is kind of a new one that's rolling out, is Defender for IoT. Now, IoT, we heard about it for OT and IoT for manufacturing environments, home, and whatever. But basically, a lot of this comes down into, in terms of how do you actually do asset management? What's a vulnerability that you have in your organization? How can you actually tell? And so when we actually think of IoT, IoT is really crucial in compliant-oriented activities, because you need to know everything that's connected into your net and everything that's connected onto the subnets and the VLANs. And as an example, for instance, we have this case where Defender of IoT. You see, like, we're actually going through and interrogating what's going on for all the devices in the net. Now, Defender for IoT is really an interesting product, and as we roll into futures, you're going to see more of this in the future from KAMIND. But as what Defender IoT does, all those endpoints that run Defender P2 endpoint become scanners. And that's what you have to internalize. So you have all these endpoints that you have workstations, environments. So you don't have to go deploy a new scanner into the environment to do anything. You just got to enable data collections on the existing deployment of what you have. That's what Defender for IoT, that's how it's enabled. And it's really from a process standpoint that you look in terms of how a threat action would happen with Defender IoT. And you got to keep in mind that it's all about this combination of exposure, access, lateral movement, which is a big one, and then basically that's the action to take. So when you look at IoT, when you look at any type of activity, you see this model that basically, how do we you see this model that put in place of how do we actually do detection? How do we do analysis of it? And how do we make sure that we're doing the right things? And so you start getting more and more decision-making capability, and using some of the AI tools like Copilot, we can actually have a better idea if the exposure is a real exposure or if it's basically they haven't really achieved anything. So we covered a lot of information on Defender in terms of Defender for Cloud. Now, keep in mind, it's pieces that you put in places. So the next steps that really I would strongly recommend you to do is go take and start deploying some of the agents. If you actually haven't deployed Defender for P2, actually push it out there. Understand what it does and what it doesn't do. And now's the best time to do it as you kind of look in terms of your environment. Now, so a couple other things as kind of housekeeping. We just posted a new blog. This is kind of interesting as a blog. It's called, they have something known as a PCI. Now everyone thinks that PCI thinks of credit card processing, but whoever came up with this is that in terms of blog from Microsoft, we actually had some Microsoft, they use PCI as the permitted creep index in terms of policies. And what's interesting about that is that when you talk about trying to do centralizing policy management, you're trying to put all policies together and basically have an organization with a set of policy that flows down to all the subs. And there's capabilities in 365 that enables that for mergers and acquisitions now. So a little bit more on security, just to kind of make sure that keep us all on the same page. Managed security from a KAMIND perspective is really managing the kill chain. That's what we do. So we try to put the necessary controls in place to make sure that we kind of address all the issues associated with the threat actors and everything else. So it's like trying to figure out how to prioritize it. How do we actually do it? So what we require for employees is that we actually have them go, if they actually onboard an environment, we actually basically have them look in terms of what the threat level and everything else that they actually have and how to actually take and pay attention to it. So we onboard an environment, we onboard a device into the environment with the assumption that the device is going to be breached. So we actually look at everything from a standpoint of trying to figure out how the best way to actually mitigate and address the kill chain. And that's what it's all about. That's what cybersecurity is all about. And when you talk about compliance is about how do you reduce risk. So in our cybersecurity program, for instance, we have our Guard Security. We also have Fortress and Fortress G. The main difference with one of them, Guard Security is focused on the NIST 800 on the CMC L1. Guard Regular Fortress is focused on NIST 800 171, and Fortress Guard Plus is focused on NIST 800 171 or CMC level 2 in a environment where you have CUI, that's confidential unclassified information. But that gives you an idea in terms of what you look for, the type of products you actually want to deploy, but also from a standpoint, what are the capabilities that you have? Now, one of the other things we had in terms of all our products as we go through, we hit this model in terms of right on this threat curve in terms of how it actually works with NIST 800 171. So that's kind of our target. So hopefully you had a chance to ride on little speedboats today. Those are pretty cool. And also what we actually have is we announced, this was on September 19th, we actually announced Guard Plus. And Guard Plus is our online security assessment tool. So if you want to know how your environment's performing against our standard, run the risk assessment tool, figure out where the pieces are and figure out what needs to be addressed. And so that's kind of the key thing. There's video material up there that really help you along the line. Our webinar schedule, we're going to do planning for next year, CMC 2.1, if it ever comes out. We're kind of waiting bated breath. And also we'll do Copilot and why you need to do it. And it's kind of interesting with Copilot. I would strongly recommend that if you haven't started this yet, go basically play with Bing Chat Enterprise until you get the bits released to you. So it's a pretty cool toy. We use it internally quite a lot. Now, in terms of the other call actions that you need to have is really it's a couple one. Just manage, monitor your security. And basically, if you don't know in the pieces in terms of what happens, give us a call and we can help you manage the security side of it. And also, if you're interested in getting our Defender for Cloud white paper, just click this link and kamind.com/feedback and just go and leave us the notes about it and you'll get a copy of the webinar paper in return. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mr. Mike.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for all the good information. So at this point, we'd like to just open it up for any questions anybody has. Feel free to unmute and ask away.
One of the key, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, one of the things that we get asked a lot, and I mentioned it a little bit on the, in terms of the, Defender for IoT is how it really works. And when you actually start thinking about all those workstations and all those servers are actually scanners, it's really interesting to see what they have access to. And when you actually start seeing the graphs of data that they actually generate and the network topology that's generated from it, really actually really opens up a lot of things in terms of capabilities that you have.
Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. We'd like to answer any questions you might have.
One of the other questions we had is that how easily is it to actually deploy like Defender for Cloud features for data collections? And it's actually very feature because it's very easy. You have, if you're in the Defender for Cloud, you go to the Defender for Cloud, basically Azure portal, you can actually go download the agents on them to basically start collecting data. If you haven't been already collecting data using like the Microsoft management agent, which also collects data for you and uploads it. So you could easily get access and build it out. And once you have all the pieces in there, at that point, it's pretty straightforward. If you want to actually push out Defender P2 products for it, that's the Defender endpoint for servers. It just matters how licenses and it'll automatically deploy it for you. And some of the other, and start remediating resources and telling you what issues you need to address. It's really a pretty cool tool to how it's actually implemented.
So if you go to the yellow URL link here at the bottom of the screen and fill that out, just feedback on our webinar, we will send you the Defender for Cloud white paper, help you digest things a little bit better. I mean, that was a lot of information to go through pretty quick. So the Defender for Cloud white paper, that will break it down, help you understand a little bit more, and maybe answer some questions you might have. And again, if you'd like your questions answered right now, or you're just curious about something, please feel free to unmute and ask away. We love audience participation. Pretty quiet out there. Come on, somebody's got to have a question. Matt, so I have a question. Can you explain, I don't think you covered this, the difference between Cloud App Security, CAS, and the Defender for Cloud?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Mike. Cloud app security, which is really when you get like when we look at threat actors, and also there's two types of threat actors. We look at lateral attacks, which means that where's a golden ticket or a golden hash that comes in when someone actually compromised a user system. That service is actually part of Defender for Identity, because what Microsoft did when they look at cloud app security, they looked at it from a standpoint and said, what's a fundamental part of it? And it's about user identity, and that's what you're trying to say. And so what cloud app security does with this lateral detection and lateral attack, they're basically trying to look to see through Defender for Identity, that's where the configuration is. For those who don't know what a lateral attack is and why kind of we're constantly, and that's one of my hot buttons, and we always want instrument for that, is that what a user system can be compromised. And if a user has like admin controls over it, so they could actually click on a link, be a bad actor comes in, get phished and basically that system get compromised. And the bad actor installs something on the system. So when a help desk tech comes and does remote into that desktop using a remote RDP software, the Microsoft RDP, since they're assuming that's internal net, it's probably secure. What happens is when they access that system remotely, then the bad actor basically looks at the Kerberos security key and they basically rehash it. And they now hash it at that level of whatever that person that did the administration support. Now, if that person was an enterprise admin, then suddenly they have global credentials to enterprise admin. Now, when you have the Kerberos key or the hash, you don't have to log into the environments anymore. Basically, you can bypass MFA, bypass everything, bypass all the controls because you have the encrypted key for the environment for all authentication. So you just need to know a user account. And you can just walk through the entire environment with a Kerberos key. That's known as a golden ticket. The detection software for that is actually Cloud App Security and enabling lateral attacks and looking at who's using lateral attacks. And lateral attacks, when you see the reports, it's like, okay, why is this person running remote PowerShell at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday night? When you and there's in cases where people have I talked to some of my friends, and there's cases where they say, yeah, we're into an environment, I'm seeing a lateral attack and it's at 2 a.m. in the morning, and then I turn around and talk to my wife and say, why is your name on the system? Were you doing something? But that's the type of thing, because now what you found out is that account was compromised and they're basically using someone's credentials. But that's the type of stuff you have, and that's what happens. You start looking at saying, why would you do this? What type of things you do? What type of activities? So as a IT administrator, you're much more aware of your environment and where the behaviors are. And a lot of the detection that we're putting in place now in systems with the AIs are basically looking at patterns of behavior and using all these existing tools to basically make the environments more secure. So good question, Mike. Kind of long answer, but Defender for Identity, just part of that service. Deploy it on all your domain controllers, you'll be happier.
Well, thanks, Matt. So I'd like to remind everybody that if you search KAMIND IT on Google, we have all of our webinars, and there's getting to be quite a few of them out there now. Over time, we do one per month. So if you're ever interested in what's out there in the way of recordings, there's a host of them out there to go look at if you're interested. And again, if you want the Defender for Cloud white paper, just hit our URL link there. Give us some brief feedback about today's webinar, and we'll be happy to get you over the white paper.
Yeah. And the best way to get to the YouTube site is to go to www.cam.com, and at the bottom, go select the icon for the YouTube icon to actually take you over to the YouTube site. That's the simplest way to get to it.
Good to know. All right, well, last call for questions. Again, if you have any questions, we really enjoy our audience participation. Looks like all quiet here on the Western Front. Well, Again, we appreciate you joining today. We'll give you back 20 minutes of your day. We look forward to seeing you on the next KAMIND webinar. And if you happen to think of any questions, post webinar, just email us, let us know, give us a call, whatever you want to do. Be happy to answer your questions for you. Again, thanks for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks all.